Hello, and welcome to Scientist.com's Unraveling European Animal Welfare Legislation for Biotech and Pharma. My name is Megan Loy. I'm the Senior Category Director of In Vivo and GLP Services at Scientist.com, and I'll be your host today. Let's get started. So you might be wondering why Scientist.com is talking about animal welfare, and it's because we're actually a solution for outsourcing research, which includes services involving live animals. The Scientist.com marketplace has over 4,000 suppliers, and we connect large and small research organizations with suppliers of all sorts of different services and products. We were built by scientists and for scientists. We've completed over 40,000 projects with $1 billion in sales, and we have a team of experts that you can talk to anytime. There's a nice little chat button in the corner of our website, and we're always around to help you with your outsourcing. We can also assist you with comparing timelines and proposals and help you source research and materials that meet your organizational requirements. So if you joined us for any of our previous sessions, you might remember, but I'm just going to give you a little bit of a throwback here so you can have a refresher. Last time, or in our first session, we talked about North America, and we really focused on the development of animal welfare in North America as a response to the utilitarian nature in which animals were used. So a lot of early animal welfare or anti-cruelty laws were based upon the fact that animals were important to human survival and that they were tools that needed to be cared for. We covered federal legislation and regulations in Canada, the United States, and Mexico. And we also heard from Megan LaFollette of the 3RC and from Diana at Stardust Oncology. In our last session, we covered Asia Pacific, specifically those countries where our clients tend to outsource most frequently. We talked about how religious traditions actually shaped animal welfare law in that region rather than the utilitarian nature of animals. And then we heard from Dr. Danyi Wen of Shanghai Lidi. So moving on to today, we're going to actually start with a little bit of history of animal welfare in the EU. And it's quite different from the previous examples we gave. So all the way back, talking about early Greek philosophy, there was a lot of discussion around whether or not animals actually had souls. And Pythagoras thought that animals did, and Plato, Aristotle, a few different folks actually thought that even though we're the only ones that have immortal souls, or whether animals have souls or not, they really saw that meat was kind of a luxury item. They thought that it made people more, I guess, spoiled and warmongering, which is a really interesting take on it. So a lot of these people were actually vegetarians. Moving on, you can see there's a little bit of an update here. Zeno thought that animals were actually undeserving of justice, which is an interesting thought. But some of these men thought that animals could reason. And they actually all practiced a vegetarian diet, but there were a lot of different reasonings behind that, as I mentioned before. So some thought animals were sentient, some didn't. It created a big argument about reasoning and consciousness in animals that still persists through this day. And it demonstrates that many of the same reasons for not eating animals today are the same as those in the past, whether that's out of reasoning for spirituality, health, peace, or even justice. So moving on, we're going to skip a little bit here to the Age of Enlightenment. And at this point, there were a lot of influential philosophers that had some pretty contrasting views of the issue on animal consciousness. Descartes, specifically, he's a key figure in kind of the scientific revolution, but he had a mechanistic view of our world. He considered animals to be basically automatons. They didn't have consciousness or self-awareness. They were kind of just acting on instinct. He thought that they were fairly complex, but that they didn't possess a mind or a soul in the same way that humans did. And he thought animals were just guided by kind of reflexes. Rousseau, moving on from that, really thought that animals were sentient beings with feelings. So that's a big contrast. Rousseau was obviously a leading figure in the Enlightenment. He was a little bit more compassionate and empathetic towards animals, and He had a work that he published, Discourse on the Origin and Basis of Inequality Among Men, in 1755. And this really argued that animals, like much like humans, could experience pleasure and pain. And he really pushed that we're all interconnected as living beings. And he rejected this idea that animals were machines. So, this perspective really led to the development of a more empathetic approach to animals. It recognized their capacity for suffering, and there was also a sense of moral responsibility towards their well being. You'll see in between these two items, a couple of interesting things happened. One was the first real animal cruelty law uh, in Europe, an act against plowing by the tail and pulling the wool off living sheep. That was in Ireland. And then you'll see as well the Massachusetts Body of Liberties, which we discussed in our American or our North American session, kind of wrote their same law around that same time. And once again, both of those anti cruelty laws were more about animal value relative to human lives and not as much about moral issues. So, moving on, people really started to believe that because these animals could experience pain and pleasure as well, that we needed to understand their behavior. So, Frederic Cuvier was the head keeper of a menagerie at a natural history museum in Paris in the early 1800s, and he actually wanted to understand and kind of really get a grasp on the development of behaviors in captive mammals. And he obviously had a really good chance to do that, being the head keeper. He also was a member of the Foreign Society and a chair of comparative physiology. So he did a lot of work in the comparison of these different animals, especially in captivity. Around this time, there was also the Cruel Treatment of Cattle Act in the UK. And then you can see there's a lot of things happening in close succession here in the UK. So, Alfred Russel Wallace was a naturalist, he was a biologist. He was also a co discoverer of the theory of evolution by natural selection, along with Darwin. But we really know him a lot for, although we know him a lot for evolutionary biology, he did have some views on animal behavior, which was really interesting. I think because he had traveled so much and had seen so much of the natural world, he was concerned about ethical treatment. And he described a lot of observations of behavior of animals in natural habitats. And he really thought that studying animals in their natural environments, as opposed to captive environments, was the only way you could truly understand their behavior and ecology. So he was pretty critical of confining animals to artificial settings for experiments, and he thought it distorted their natural behaviors. So, in general, it was a little bit of a balance for him between the pursuit of scientific knowledge and a moral responsibility to treat these animals well and to respect and consider their well-being. Around this time, the Cruel Treatment of Cattle Act was also passed. So that was really the first kind of British legal action, and that amended some. Uh, there was also an 1835 act that you see here that amended the previous act, and that actually expanded the legislation to prohibit keeping premises for the purposes of doing things like staging fighting or bear baiting dogs, bulls, badgers, or any other kind of animal, whether it was domestic or wild caught. And this really facilitated further legislation to protect animals. It allowed the creation of some of the shelters, the veterinary hospitals, and more humane transportation and slaughter. So this act also banned, but really kind of failed to eradicate dog fighting and cockfighting. And you can see in this era as well, the RSPCA was founded, which is really critical turning point. Just like with the North American discussion that we had, the RSPCA really allowed for a lot of legislation to be pushed forward and passed. This then starts to spread internationally around this time. So, organized animal protection can be traced back really far, but back in the 18th century, these first attempts were made in Great Britain to basically make animal protection legislative instead of just an idea. And they were successful. So, the Act for the Prevention of Cruel and Improper Treatment of Cattle being passed was a really big stepping stone. And then, as I mentioned, the RSPCA was founded. There were also vegetarianism societies and movements as well. And There were a lot of religious theories or revival theories around this time, evangelicism, but this started to spread uh, quite a bit farther. So early on, when urbanization and industrialization was taking place, it helped to give animals a status other than that of mere utility objects. So you can see around this time when these laws are being enacted in Germany, in Switzerland, France, Sweden, that it's really about, or it's around the time that we're starting to use machines more to kind of conduct business and create things rather than animals. So Great Britain obviously was not the only country that had organized animal groups, protection groups, but they were pioneers, and that spread over to Germany. So the first German animal protection association was called the Fatherland Association for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, and it was founded by a pastor. And shortly after, there were similar associations um, founded kind of around in other cities. And the main goals of these was really to uh, morally improve the population. It actually wasn't necessarily only about animal welfare, but they saw it as a moral imperative that we treat animals better. And internationally, in the last third of this century, almost all the European countries, the Protestant ones a little earlier than the Catholic ones, and their colonies, as well as the United States, eventually kind of followed suit by starting these animal protection associations. So the shifting perspectives on this are not new. Animals, um, the shifting perspectives are not new, but we've been having this debate for a long time. Is it instinct or reason? And now that we're getting into the later part of the 1800s, we see people are starting to really believe that animals aren't just tools. They're not something that we should treat kindly just because we want to have good morals or that we want to be within our religious upbringing, but that we should treat them well because it's harm to animals and those are sentient beings. So you can see Darwin also kind of believe this, that there are more attributes attributed with animals to reason and less to instinct. So this is really getting some momentum at the end of this century. Expansions then started to, or protections then started to expand. So the Anti-Vivisection Society in 1875, there was a Cruelty to Animals Act that set actual limits, finally, on experimentation. Instead of just viewing the animals as objects that we needed to treat well, it set some specific limits and instituted a licensing system that was in place for 110 years. That's a very long time for a piece of legislation to remain in effect and really impactful. So that's a quite impressive bit of work there. And there also started to be some other kind of movement around Europe at this time. So the anti-cruelty provision there of 1877. And then there was an international society founded to combat against what they called scientific torture of animals. So you can see we're coming right up here against the early 1900s. And as we all know, there was a bit of a gap there. But right as the century turned, there was what was called the anti-vivisection movement. So there was a real big political controversy around vivisection in Britain from 1903 to 1910. And basically, the University of London medical lectures were infiltrated by Swedish feminists. And there were also fights between medical students and the police, and police protection for the statue of this dog. And the controversy was triggered by these allegations that in 1903, a professor in the Department of Physiology performed an illegal vivisection before an audience of 60 medical students on this brown terrier dog that you can see in the statue. He was anesthetized, but well, the professor said that he was adequately anesthetized. According to the people that were watching, they said the animal was conscious and struggling. And the procedure was really condemned as being a cruel and unlawful act. So this led to a lot of issues, and the professor actually sued for libel and won. So these anti-vivisectionists commissioned a bronze statue of the dog as a memorial, and it was unveiled in 1906, but it actually made medical students pretty upset. And it led to a lot of clashes through central London. Hundreds of medical students marched and they had effigies of the brown dog. They clashed with suffragettes and other protesters, trade unionists, and then there were 300 police officers. So these are known as the Brown Dog Riots. Finally, in 1910, the local council was really pretty much sick of this. So they sent some workers, accompanied by police officers, to take the statue out under the cover of darkness, and then they reportedly melted it down. So a new statue was commissioned and was erected in 1985. And in 2021, on the 115th anniversary of this, a new campaign was launched by an author to recast the original statue. So you can see this brown dog affair is still living on to these in this day, and we can see folks over here protesting as well. Now, there's a little bit of a gap, as I mentioned, in this next era of history, because from 1920 to 1950-ish, there were, a lot of world wars and issues going on. So there was a kind of gap in animal protection regulation. But in the post-World War II era, it also meant an introduction of animals to intensive agriculture systems and a really big rise in the use of animals in biomedical research. So this also led to the rise of the field of biomedical ethics. And people were concerned with what constituted moral considerations for humans, but they didn't really mind animals or animal use so much until we started seeing these vegetarian societies kind of pop up. And then, as we all remember, or hopefully remember from previous sessions, Silent Spring, Animal Machines, etc., Jane Goodall kind of started to change people's opinion and really start to shift things. So there was also around this time the Bramble Report in Britain, which led to the 5 freedoms that we know. So freedom from hunger and thirst, discomfort, pain, injury, and disease, the freedom to express normal behavior, and the freedom from fear and distress. So there's a lot of shifts happening very quickly right here. And now we get to a really interesting era in which the legislation is starting to catch up with the public sentiment. So a lot of animal protection laws were passed in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Denmark, France, the Netherlands, and then finally we see the Council of Europe. So that's a massive change here. Whereas previous legislation in countries was not centralized in any way, and some specifically places in Germany, for example, had different legislation in each province or region. Now we're taking this as an overall approach. So the European Directive regarding the protection of animals used for experimental and other scientific purposes in 1986 was really, really critical. That allowed us to really expand in the late 20th century to build upon this previous legislation. So the establishment of the European Economic Community in 1957, the Amsterdam Treaty, the Lisbon Treaty, and then finally the Council directives that concern the protection of animals kept for farming purposes. That was based on the 5 freedoms. And since then, the EU has passed a lot of laws, those that phase out the use of battery cages for hens that you can see here in the top right. And then there was a Fur Farming Act in the year 2000 that outlawed fur farming in England and Wales. Scotland has also outlawed it. And the EU has recently banned construction of new gestation crates for pigs as well. So a really interesting era in the time of animal welfare. And around this, Spain also passed a measure, but it was non-legislative, that granted non-human primates the right to life, liberty, and freedom from use in experiments. However, it does require further action from the government to become a formal law, which hasn't quite happened yet. So now we're coming up to the 21st century, and that's when we're starting to expand public awareness. You might be aware of the Cambridge Declaration of Consciousness in 2012, and this, we're finally saying, like, yes, animals are sentient. And there's been a broader recognition of animal welfare issues, more comprehensive legislation, and topics such as animal fighting, pet ownership, treatment of exotic animals have come under legislative scrutiny. So there's increased awareness and concerns, and that leads to the development of more stringent legislation. There's also been a trend towards international collaboration on animal welfare. So organizations and initiatives, both governmental and NGO, they work together to address global challenges. Obviously, things like wildlife trafficking and treatment of animals in cross-border trade cannot be adequately legislated by only one nation, and they really require cooperation. And this legislation is continuing to evolve. There's ongoing efforts to strengthen the existing laws as well as introducing new measures, and public awareness, scientific advancements, and our changing attitude towards animals is contributing to the ongoing development of animal welfare laws in these regions. So for those of you that are not from the EU and are not as familiar, like I wasn't, I thought it might help to explain a little bit about how legislation there works. So the European Union establishes common standards and legislation that applies across all of their member states. And those key regulations and directives related to animal welfare are developed at the EU level, so at the top there. Those are then transposed into national law. So EU regulations and directives can be created or basically developed into law by each member state. And that process involves integrating the EU requirements into the legal systems of individual countries, because obviously they all have different legal setups and standards. And so that EU level legislation has to then be transposed or basically translated into the local legal dialect. Then there's national implementation and enforcement. So once those are transposed, national authorities are responsible for enforcing and implementing those laws within their countries. And that includes things like monitoring compliance, doing inspections, and punishing violators. There's national variations, however. While the EU regulations are a baseline, member states do have flexibility. So they don't just have to take whatever the EU law is. They can implement additional measures or more stringent standards to address specific circumstances or cultural considerations, whatever it might be. So there might be some variation in how these laws are applied across different countries. The member states then collaborate and they exchange information on best practices, challenges, innovations, etc., so that they can learn and lead to improvements. And then the European Food Safety Authority and European Medicines Agency can also play roles in kind of assessing this. Below that, then obviously there is regional law, and then below that, local law, although those aren't as likely to apply in the case of animal welfare. So the major legislation that kind of governs all of this for the EU is Directive 2010/63. And that's a legislation on the protection of animals for scientific purposes. It's one of the most stringent ethical and welfare standards worldwide. This actually repealed the Directive 86, 609 EEC. You might have seen that in one of my previous slides where I showed that in 1986. But this directive became formally applied across the EU in January of 2013. So it protects living non-human vertebrates, including independently feeding larval forms and fetal forms of mammals from the last third of their normal development. And it also protects live cephalopods. So you might notice that this is a little bit different from the Animal Welfare Act, which specifically excludes mice, rats, and birds. And the ultimate aim of this directive is actually to replace animals in research. It's not just to protect them, which I think is a really interesting point here. So really going for the 3 R's is critical in this. The scope of the directive, as I mentioned, it covers all live animals and any of those that are used for testing or other development things. So the directive harmonizes the legislation, and it was implemented and in each of the EU member states. But once again, member states that have stricter measures to protect research animals or that had those laws before the directive was introduced, they can maintain them as long as they don't hinder EU-wide scientific cooperation and trade. So the idea is that if you have stricter laws, that's fine, as long as you're not slowing down science and trade. The directive also promotes the 3 R's principle. So we've talked about this before: replacement, reduction, and refinement. And it really encourages the use of alternatives specifically. So replacement, it's a requirement of the directive that you consider the 3 R's, not just a suggestion. It also requires authorization and project evaluation. So, researchers that are going to use animals, they have to obtain authorization. It's not just a suggestion, again. So, all animal projects have to undergo an ethical and scientific evaluation, and they all have to comply with the three R's in order to move forward. That ethical review is required to be carried out by competent folks, trained people for the procedures, and they also want to make sure that animals are getting the appropriate care, that they are having pain, suffering, etc., minimized. So this is really critical that we are ensuring our procedures are carried out by those who are trained for it. The other thing that the directive calls out that's really interesting is categories of severity. So you can see the pain can go from severe to moderate to mild to non-recovery, which is actually a little bit different from just the mild. I don't know if it should sit right there, but they're categorized in these levels based on the potential that they may experience during procedures. So higher standards of care and ethical considerations are going to apply to animals in higher severity categories. So if animals are likely to experience something like severe pain or long-term moderate pain, they need to have a little bit more attention paid and higher standards to care for them and try to reduce that as much as possible. And all experiments are categorized by severity. The directive also led to or demanded, required reporting and transparency. So all member states in the EU have to report their information on animals that they use for science. They need to tell you the numbers, the types, purposes, and the methods employed. So here's an example of animals used for scientific purposes in Spain in 2020. And you can actually find all of this publicly available. So there's hashtag EU animal stats, and this can be looked up for all different EU member countries, which I think is a really interesting bit of transparency that's quite impressive. It also led to education and training. So the directive included provisions for educating and training people to ensure that those that are involved in animal research are adequately skilled and that they're informed about the ethical consideration. And this isn't just for technicians. So the European Union is committed to replacing the use of animals in scientists, and they really want to get this out for the public because they need young scientists to help achieve that goal. So there's a lot of different organizations that produce educational content for this and that are appropriate for all different ages and that you can visit if you want to teach your kids about it or anyone who's not familiar with animal research. It's a really important effort. And then finally, on the negative side, there are penalties. So each state has to have penalties that are effective. They dissuade people from breaking the law and they are proportionate. So if they go against the directive or they do something in violation, it's actually required by the law that they receive an effective punishment. And finally, I just want to circle back to this. We talked about how the EU level legislation works, but we didn't talk about individual countries. So, as I mentioned before, there are national laws that also apply. So, where specific parts of a country's laboratory animal welfare standards are higher, they are permitted to retain them. So, a great example of this is in the UK. It retains its additional protection for cats, dogs, horses, and primates. However, the minimum regulations set by the EU are actually really high by international standards. So while there are some examples of national standards going kind of above and beyond the EU directive, um, for the most part, they are high. And the specific legal frameworks that are around animal research are shared by the UK and the EU. They've been transposed into UK law. So that means that the current regulations are going to continue to apply despite the fact that the UK has left the European Union. So that's why we're still including them here today. They have enshrined the EU directive into their law already. So there's no concern moving forward that any of that is going to change. And this is quite a bit of a contrast from previous discussions. You might remember we talked about legislation in Canada, where the legislation was really minimum requirements, and it was just about oversight and sanctions. So that's similar to the US as well that we talked about. So there's no real direct legislation. Although the US has two federal laws that apply, it's more of that traditional command and control law. It gives authority to the USDA and to APHIS, but it doesn't, it's largely a non regulatory system, and it just basically establishes assurances and policies that covered research areas or facilities must follow. So states in the US and Canada play like more of a minor role in animal research protection. Now, this is in contrast again to Mexico, which we discussed before. They have federal and state level legislation addressing animal welfare. And the general law of ecological equilibrium and environmental protection in Mexico has provisions that relate to wildlife as well. And other states have their own laws, concerning welfare of domestic animals. But the Norma Oficial Mexicana is actually a combination of kind of the AVMA guidelines, the guide, and the Canadian Council guide. So there's a lot of different things that go into that and have become enshrined in law there. So if you contrast that again with the EU directive, it's one of the most stringent ethical and welfare standards worldwide. Again, the ultimate aim of this is to replace animals in research, whereas we talked about before with kind of Canada and the US, some of that legislation, it's more of a command and control situation rather than a guideline of protection or replacement. There are some key differences in these areas as well. So I did want to point out a couple of things that are different between the guide and the EU. The scope, obviously, the guide is a published reference, whereas the directive is actual legislation for the member states. And as such, the guide does not have legal authority, whereas the EU is a legal document that must be transposed into legislation. Also, the coverage is for live vertebrates rather than focus on mammals. And ethical principles are promoted, but in the EU, it's actually required. Environmental enrichment, social housing, those again are encouraged by the guide, but they're more required in the EU. Social housing is encouraged where appropriate, but in the US, we talk more about it being compatible with research goals and well-being. And then finally, veterinary care, the guide stresses its importance, while the EU really mandates its provision. Also, we discussed the Animal Welfare Act a little bit as opposed to the directive. We have some different things as far as ethical review and project authorization. So in the US, we usually call it an IACUC, but in Europe, it's determined by each member state. So you might hear it called an ethical review board or other things. Some states have their own kind of higher level group that determines which studies are appropriate in procedures rather than going to individual units such as CROs or research organizations that have their own IACUC. And for projects to be authorized, in the US, you really only have to register with USDA if you're doing covered species, but in Europe, we cover all species. Finally, the categories of severity, just a little bit different nomenclature, similar idea. And then the education and training is in the US, again, based on the guide, where in Europe it's determined by each member state, but again, is required. So when you start to think of the practical considerations for this, it can get really intense to outline. A lot of differences are in things like housing, specifically caging size. You can see here these primates have access to natural daylight. They're out in a group, they're uncaged. They might be group housed. Specifically, you might need to remove animals from their home room or home cage in order to have specific procedures. Making sure you're doing things in a separate procedure room, especially euthanasia, can be really critical. And this leads to a lot of differences in technicians, in housing, in just basic study conduct and the length of time that it takes to do anything. I worked in a facility that had primates both in EU style housing and the 4x4 or the 2x2 four bankers that some of us know from primate facilities. And I can tell you that being in the EU housing, it does take a considerable amount of time to remove animals from their home cage, to bring them to the procedure room, and then to return them. But it does lead to a lot of benefits. Although the additional kind of cost of housing and technician hours and things like that can lead to some people kind of pushing against that and wanting to go with traditional housing where it's possible to do so. Um, that being said, it's very important when you are requesting a study that you be sure what your organizational requirements are, because CROs in different places of the world might adhere to different standards. So you may go to a CRO in the US, like I worked at, that does have European style housing, and you can ask for that. So it's important to make sure that you are following your organizational requirements and not requesting a study that goes against your ethical review in your organization. Now, what do we do with all of this information? There's so many different possibilities and legislative areas, study types, species, procedures, policies, that it can be difficult to navigate all of this. And the way that we work at scientist.com is actually supporting you in that process. So we do conduct due diligence, which is why we're talking about animal welfare today. Our Comply suite of tools have specific agreements that you can add, and you can also ask researchers, or researchers can tell us what they're doing. So are you using live animals? And that can do something like add an animal welfare rider to any statements of work that you receive. It can also help you find someone that needs to review a study, or ensure you have ethical review. And our Verify program is an extension of that. So we do have wonderful independent third-party auditors that can go out and do a pre-assessment of supplier sites. And then that information is shared across organizations so that we can all benefit from each other's learning and be more transparent. We also have an animal welfare request for information. So this is part of our kind of digital compliance, where we ask suppliers for each of their sites about their animal welfare policies and procedures. And this can get very detailed. There are different ways to review this. And then there's a lot of additional information and clarifications that can be requested as well. So if you're reviewing something like this and you say, hey, actually, I'm not sure about their response for their IACUC and I'd like to know more, you can either check the additional documentation that comes along with it. You might see there's some clarification documents there, or you can ask me or review clarifications that are requested by other clients. So that's the great thing, is that if you come to me and you say, hey, Megan, I'd like you to check this facility and find out what their recent inspection date is, I will go chase that down for you. I'll come back and I'll share that clarification with other clients as well. So it might be that you have a question about an RFI, and then you go to review the documents and you see that it has already been clarified and answered. So again, the information sharing and transparency is really critical here. You can also specifically badge supplier sites. So this is a really nice way to have kind of a single source of truth. And we don't want researchers to have to review each individual animal welfare RFI and try to determine if that site is appropriate for their work. Obviously, that's a lot to ask, and we don't expect everybody to be an expert in individual legislation and laws in different regions. So what we can do is we can go in and give them, I kind of call it a bit of flair here with the badge, and we can say, yes, this supplier has been evaluated, they're green, or they're denied, they're red, and it's just a really nice easy way to communicate that information to researchers. And because that's in the system, we can also use that to help guide their selections. So if you want your researchers to always go to places that are already approved for animal welfare, we can build that in. And then finally, in our request compliance as well, we can pull out what's important to you and customize this. So if you want to know about high severity grade, or you're really concerned about non-human primate studies, for example, we can ask your researcher specific questions that they need to answer, and we can add folks from your team to approve it or just kind of watch it based on those risk levels. And this information also can go into reporting. So if you want to know how many of your requests involve a high severity or pain grade, we can go ahead and pull that out for you. And this can also, as I mentioned, apply any legal terms. as needed. So if you have an animal welfare rider or something like that, this can automatically do that for you. And this is a really nice option because researchers may not be aware that these things need to happen, and it reduces the need for them to send emails or ask around. It allows the system to automatically take care of this for you, and you get a nice email that says such and such request requires approval, and you can go in and review and say yes or no. We can also ask questions when proposals are submitted. So if you're not concerned about a researcher asking around about a request, and you only want to look when they're ready to purchase, we can do that. And we can ask very specific questions that can be customized again. So we can just ask, how many animals are you using? What species? Are they being euthanized, to help you with your tracking and usage data? Or we can get more specific. In this example, we're asking the researcher to provide the humane endpoints for one of their studies. So we can be very customized with this and help you with your animal welfare review and your ethical review to make sure that researchers are kind of following the right path. It's a lot easier for them when we light up the way instead of just closing doors. And then finally, based on all of those questions, or basically anything and that goes into the system, we can assign custom approvers. So if you want all requests from China to go to a specific approver, or requests that are involving fish to go to someone different, or requests that are for tox versus DMPK, we can distribute your approvers in any way, including location. So there's a lot of customization that's available with this. And again, what it does is reduce the need to chase people around to get approvals. It allows researchers to just kind of go along the path to getting their research done, still ethically and compliantly, but without a lot of extra emails and calls. And especially what I've noticed is that if they don't know that they need ethical approval, or they're new to the organization, they're not aware, this can really help guide them along that pathway without slowing their research down. So if you'd like to get in touch with me, I'm always happy to answer questions. It's just my first name at scientist.com. You can also message me on LinkedIn. You can call me. I'm always open to setting up discussions. And if you get an email from me, there's a nice little link there that allows you to set a meeting at your convenience. So I would love to talk to you about any animal welfare questions you have, workflows, compliance, anything like that. Feel free at your convenience. And with that, we're going to go ahead and jump into the Q&A. So I am looking forward to answering your questions. There will be some great references and resources available for you after the webinar. I will go ahead and get those available for you and get them put up. So the first question I see we have is, when do you expect a new EU directive? And that is a really good question. The last EU directive was in place for about 20 years. The current one has been in place for a little over 10 years. So I wouldn't expect anything to pop up in the next couple of years here, but I know that usually when these things get revised, there is the opportunity for comments and other things. So I would definitely keep an eye out if you are a member of any laboratory animal groups or things like that, to see if you have a chance to comment on that legislation and really help it be as comprehensive and effective as possible. So the next question we have, I see, is working in the EU, I find all the legislation a little bit difficult, and I feel that it was written as if we don't already care very much about the welfare of animals. So this is a really, really interesting concept. You know what? I actually do understand and agree with that a little bit. It can get difficult to continue working with animals and working in the way that we all work, and really understanding how much we care and that we're trying to do our best. And then seeing that sometimes legislation is written in a way that seems more like we don't know what's going on, or we're only trying to publish wrongdoers. And I think it's really important to remember that legislation is often written that way. Legislation is often penalty-based rather than guidance-based. So we have to take that with a grain of salt. And I think that's part of the reason we have other written guidelines besides legislation, things like the guide or handbooks to care and use. Those are really more made for us, made for the technicians, made for the researchers, to actually, it actually takes into consideration that we're all trying to do our best for the animals and do the right thing. So legislation is maybe not always the best, I guess, guideline, because it is kind of fear-based, I guess, or it's penalty-based. And it's important to remember that we are all really striving to do our best. It's probably why you attended one of this session today or any of these sessions, is because we all want to do what's proper and what's right. And we do care very much about it. So I think that was a really interesting question. Thank you for asking that one. Let's see. We've also got a really interesting question about the Marseille Declaration. So you may have heard of this recently, and it's basically a declaration by a whole group of pharmaceutical industry. It's a joint declaration, basically, and it's on animal housing and use, and it tries to implement really high standards for animal housing and use internally and externally by the industry for these scientific purposes. So it goes into detail on things that have been covered in some other areas, but are just getting to a higher level. So things like the culture of care, oversight bodies, veterinary care, housing, again, education and training, etc. It also, I think one of the most interesting parts is that it pays special attention to what we sometimes call higher order species. So things like dogs, non-human primates, obviously, pigs, etc. And it really is trying to put in place that our standards should be the highest with regards to those. So it's really important. And also, I think, is a little more specific about things like post-approval monitoring, risk management, and incident reporting. Sometimes we focus so much on the actual approval of a project or request that we don't really pay attention to reviewing it afterwards, or not as much care and attention is paid. And that is actually really, really critical to review the studies that we're doing, to understand the outputs, and especially to learn from it. So when there are incidents, a lot of times in certain legislative setups, the reporting of incidents is actually kind of optional. So a lot of times you may need to report something, or you're not required to report something to, say, the USDA, for example, but you would want to report it to ALAC. But again, that's up to an individual company or organization to decide if they want to report that incident. So I think that it is really important that this calls out that formal incident reporting. It has to be clear. It has to be immediately reported. I think that's a really critical update. And there have been quite a few signatories to that to that declaration already. So Merck, German Merck, Novartis, Sanofi, and then a couple of CROs that those companies also really frequently work with. So it's really great to see more groups signing that. And there's even a group in the United States, a CRO that signed it. So it's nice to see that expanding. And then let's see, we have some other great questions here. Just going to pull some more up for review. There is a question about why there are so many different standards in the industry. This is also a really fun question. So if you notice, there's a lot of different, across the 3 sessions we've done, there's a lot of different motivations for legislation and for animal welfare in general. It started out with just penalizing cruelty specifically, or tyranny, as it was called. And now we've really progressed into an area where we're thinking of animals as sentient beings. We are legislating for their health and welfare because they can feel and reason and are sentient, rather than just for our moral imperative or for us to preserve them as tools, or that they're utilitarian. And along with all of those changing beliefs, different series or systems of legislation have also come in. So it is really confusing that there are a lot of different industry standards. I think the intention of things like the Marseille Declaration, ALAC inspections, all of that the intention is to try to harmonize somewhat across the industry, but again, that's really difficult. There can be some harmonization I find in different regions, such as the EU is pretty consistent, but then when you get into places that have maybe higher standards, or in particular academic research locations, universities, things like that, it's going to be very, very hard to apply all of those standards. And especially when you're thinking about all the training and implementation that goes into that, I think it is the ideal, obviously, to have globally harmonized industry standards for pharma, or biotech or academics, any of it. I think that would be our ultimate end goal, but I'm not so sure how quickly that's going to happen, although obviously I would love to see that. That would be great. And I also saw a great question. What do I look for in evaluating CROs? And so I would say, as far as evaluating CROs, I do try to take an approach of a holistic view of asking about their overall animal welfare and policies, and then digging into specific species and procedures if needed. I also actually do search for negative news and things like that as well. I'll often search for USDA citations or learnings, opportunities for improvement, those kinds of things, and really trying to take a kind of an overall view of them. I'll ask around. Certainly, it's always good to hear others' opinions. Specifically on scientist.com, we do have ratings for CROs. So that can really help. If I see that they're consistently 5 stars from all the researchers, it does make me a little more comfortable to go forward with them. That being said, it is important to remember that people are more likely to rate things when they have a bad experience than when they have a moderate or even a good experience. So take ratings always with a grain of salt, but reviewing their policies and procedures, I think, is one of the most important bits. I also saw a question if I see the guide updating to become more in line with EU standards. Yes, I absolutely do. I believe that there is a refresh in progress right now for the guide. I'm on the board of the 3Rs Collaborative for North America, and I believe that we were recently asked to comment on something as far as the guide goes. So if you have a wish list for the guide or commentary or anything else, I would definitely share that with the National Research Council, try to get in touch with them. I think the more of us that share our perspectives and give opinions, the better. And if you have the opportunity to do that as part of a bigger group, maybe from your laboratory or your organization, go ahead and do so. I think more input on things like that and changes that are going to impact all of us are really critical. And I definitely do think that the guide could be updated to be more in line with EU standards. As far as the question, this does also relate to the harmonization question before. I mentioned working in European housing, but in a CRO in the EU, and things like that get super complicated and really tricky really fast. It's hard to know where you can place work or what you're working to. So if the guide was more in line with the EU directives, I think that would definitely make life a lot easier for us technicians and probably everybody else working in the industry. And then I also have some really interesting questions here about legal outsourcing. So can you outsource a project from the EU to another country with lower standards? That is really tricky because it depends on where you are looking to get your drug approved. So if you are looking to get your drug approved in the US, for example, your studies generally have to conform with the US standards. So I would say if you're in the EU and you want your drug approved in the EU, follow the EU standards. Yes, it certainly is possible to outsource it somewhere else. I guess as long as you're still following those same standards, it's generally considered to be acceptable. But again, I would definitely check with your institutional leadership and make sure, because none of us ever want an experiment or a study to be unusable. It's a waste of our time. It's a waste of patient time. It's a waste of animal time in life. And it's really unnecessary. So the more due diligence that you can do ahead of time, the better. And then finally, I did want to just wrap it up here because we're getting close to the end. If you had a question that I didn't answer, feel free to reach out to me. I will email all of you after these sessions are done. I'll be happy to share all of the references and resources with hyperlinks, and we'll work on getting you some more detailed comparisons. So again, thank you so much for joining us. This is the last and final of the 3-part series, and I hope to do more impactful and helpful things like this for you in the near future. So if there's something in particular you want to learn about or see, please reach out to me or reach out to us at scientist.com, and we will definitely take that into consideration. So thanks so much. Have a wonderful rest of your day.